So imagine this. How does a man intimately familiar with intense trauma, warfare, and years of grueling captivity manage to write a hilarious, deeply moving story about an old guy tilting at windmills? I mean, really think about it. How does someone who has lived through the absolute lowest, grimiest realities of human existence turn around and invent a book that literally changes Western literature forever? Well, welcome. Today we are bringing you a full explainer on Miguel de Cervantes' absolute game changer of a masterpiece, Don Quixote. Whether you've read it a dozen times or the sheer size of the book has kept it gathering dust on your nightstand, we're going to break down exactly why the 17th century Spanish tale remains pretty much the central work in world literature. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The captive turned creator. 2. Knights, windmills, and reality. 3. Quixote and Sancho Panza. 4. Metafiction and the false sequel, and 5. The legacy of Quixote. Section 1. The captive turned creator, trauma and triumph. Okay, let's piece together a picture of a man who honestly earned his literary immortality through sheer, stubborn survival. Born back in 1547, Cervantes did not have an easy aristocratic life. Not at all. In 1571, he fought in the massive naval battle of Lepanto. He took a gunshot wound there that permanently withered his left hand, which actually earned him the nickname the One-Handed Man of Lepanto. Then, if that wasn't enough, while sailing back to Spain, pirates attacked his ship. He was held as a captive slave in Algiers for 5 agonizing years. Even after monks finally ransomed him, he lived in extreme poverty and ended up in a Spanish prison over some debts. And rumor has it, it was right there, sitting in a prison cell, that he first came up with the idea for Don Quixote, eventually publishing Part 1 in 1605. This was a guy who intimately knew the stark difference between freedom and captivity. Section 2. Knights, Windmills, and Reality. The Psychology of a Knight. You know, you've probably heard the word quixotic thrown around before. Basically, it means refusing to see the world in its actual grubby reality and instead choosing to gild it in the beauties of your own invention. And that is exactly what happens to our main character, Alonso Quijano. He suffers from a literal literature-induced madness. He reads so many heroic, chivalric romances about knights and enchanters that his brain just kind of dries up. He completely rejects his gritty 17th century surroundings. Instead, he renames himself Don Quixote, decides that a rusty barber's basin is actually a magical golden helmet, turns a poor country girl into his idealized Lady Dulcinea, and sets off on his bony old horse Rocinante. He literally gilds the world in his own imagination. But why does he do it? Well, modern psychologists look at the text and point straight to Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, specifically that crisis of generativity versus stagnation. In plain English, it's that sheer panic that hits in late adulthood when we start asking, did my life actually matter? See, Alonso Quijano is an aging man who feels like he's achieved nothing, so his transformation into a knight isn't just some funny random delusion. It's a really desperate psychological search to leave a legacy behind. He adopts this entire alternate reality just so he can have adventures, make a lasting impact, and avoid fading into nothingness.
Cervantes' real goal here was to completely demolish the massive flood of inferior, ridiculous, heroic romances that were popular in his day. Like a character in the book, the Canon of Toledo says, fictitious fables have to be wedded to the intelligence of their readers to actually arouse wonderment and joy. Cervantes was injecting a brand new psychological verisimilitude into literature. He was showing the messy, very real-world consequences of trying to actually live out a fantasy.
Section 3. Quixote and Sancho Panza. A clash of perspectives. Now, when we look at their core dynamic, and don't worry, we are keeping this entirely spoiler-free, we see just a perfect juxtaposition. On the one hand, you have Don Quixote. He's the scrawny, soaring idealist driven completely by literature, who looks out at a field and sees ferocious giants that he needs to slay. On the other hand, you've got his squire, Sancho Panza. He's a portly, earthy realist, riding a donkey, armed with rustic wisdom and a whole bunch of proverbs. He looks at that exact same field and just sees ordinary windmills. It's the ultimate multi-perspectivism. The whole narrative is basically forcing these two completely different worlds to clash, interact, and eventually kind of rub off on each other. Just listen to this from the famous windmill scene. Quixote says, "This is noble, righteous warfare, for it is wonderfully useful to God to have such an evil race wiped from the face of the earth." That quote beautifully captures his core, doesn't it? Yes, his madness is absolutely absurd. And sure, his actions cause chaos and usually get him beaten up. But that madness comes from a genuinely pure, noble desire to right the world's wrongs, defend the weak, and bring justice to a deeply corrupt society.
Underneath all that rusty armor, the guy just has an incredibly big heart.
Section 4. Metafiction and the false sequel. The novel becomes self-aware. Okay, let's walk through this absolutely wild historical sequence. Back in 1605, Cervantes publishes Part 1. It's a massive, smash hit all across Spain. Everyone loves it. But Cervantes kind of takes his time writing the sequel. Suddenly, out of nowhere in 1614, some unidentified author using the fake name Avellaneda publishes an unauthorized fake Part 2 of Don Quixote. I mean, Cervantes was understandably furious. But this spurious knockoff sequel actually motivated him to finally finish and publish the real Part 2 in 1615. But here's the absolute asinine genius part. Cervantes didn't just ignore the fake sequel, he literally brought it into his own novel and basically invented modern metafiction centuries ahead of time. By 1615, in Part 2, Don Quixote and Sancho actually find out that Part 1 of their lives has been published as a real book. They meet people in the story who have read about them. And even crazier, they find out about the fake Avellaneda sequel, and they actively complain about it, literally changing their travel plans just to prove the fake book wrong. It's mind-blowing.
He uses all these fascinating metafictional tools to pull this off. You've got characters fiercely debating their own literary portrayals. You have this unreliable Moorish historian named Cide Hamete Benengeli, who's supposedly translating the text. And, brilliantly, Don Quixote even visits a real printing press in Barcelona. The inclusion of the printing press right inside the narrative is the ultimate agent of character destabilization. Quixote actually sees the physical machinery of bookmaking, the exact same machinery that created the very chivalric romances he based his entire existence on. It completely shatters his illusions.
Section 5. The Legacy of Quixote. Why read it today? So if you're going to tackle this massive text, here are a few practical tips for you. First up, find a good modern translation. The acclaimed version by John Ormsby is a great choice because it really balances accuracy with readability. Second, do not rush it. Don Quixote was meant to be savored slowly, so take your time absorbing the episodic adventures and those amazing rich conversations between the knight and his squire. Embrace that wild blend of laugh-out-loud slapstick comedy and really profound existential tragedy. And lastly, recognize that when Quixote speaks in that bizarre, archaic language, it's just Cervantes intentionally satirizing the ridiculous books of his era.
I really want to leave you with this final, memorable tension. At the very end of the novel, on his deathbed, Alonso Quijano finally sheds his armor. He actually regains his sanity and denounces all those chivalric books as total nonsense. But Sancho Panza, the ultimate realist who has now been totally infected by his master's dreams, begs him to keep playing the game. So I have to ask you, is this return to sanity a triumphant victory for reason? Or is it, as so many critics argue, the most terribly sad scene in all of literature? That tension right there, between cold reality and beautiful imagination, is exactly why you need to pick up Don Quixote and decide for yourself. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.